My name is Penelope Shaw. I'm 35 years old, and I'm the daughter who was publicly mocked and called a family failure by my own sister during our mother's funeral service, in front of mourners who had gathered to pay their respects to a woman we both loved deeply. The devastating attack came when Audrey, my 32-year-old sister who works as a fashion model, loudly criticized the dress I was wearing to grieve our mother, calling it cheap funeral attire that proved I would never understand fashion or success the way she did, and suggesting that my presence at the funeral was somehow diminishing the dignity of the occasion because I couldn't dress appropriately for important family events. What made this moment particularly cruel was that I was barely holding myself together emotionally, having lost my mother just 3 days earlier to complications from pneumonia that had progressed rapidly and unexpectedly. I had spent those 3 days making funeral arrangements, coordinating with relatives, writing the eulogy that I would deliver through tears, and trying to process grief that felt like it would swallow me whole. The last thing I expected was to be attacked by my sister over my clothing choices during what should have been a solemn family gathering focused on honoring our mother's memory. The irony that Audrey couldn't possibly have understood in that moment was that the cheap funeral dress she was mocking cost $29,000, came from my own luxury fashion brand's latest collection, was made from Italian silk with hand-finished details that required hundreds of hours of expert craftsmanship, and represented the kind of understated elegance that only people who truly understand fashion could appreciate. The dress wasn't designed to make bold statements or attract attention. It was created for women who valued quality, craftsmanship, and timeless design over flashy logos and obvious brand signaling. But the deeper irony that would soon destroy Audrey's entire career and family standing was that I secretly owned the luxury fashion brand she regularly modeled for, that her entire professional identity was built on representing a company I had created, and that the termination letter ending her modeling contract was already signed and dated before she made the decision to insult me at our mother's funeral. The family failure she was publicly humiliating was actually her boss, her primary source of income, and the reason she had any modeling career at all. I'm a fashion entrepreneur who built my company, Maison Elodie, from the ground up over the past 12 years, creating a luxury brand that specializes in elevated basics, investment pieces, and timeless wardrobe staples that wealthy professionals and discerning customers purchase for quality rather than trend chasing. My business model focuses on exceptional materials, impeccable construction, and designs that will look as elegant in 10 years as they do today. Exactly the opposite of fast fashion or attention-seeking pieces that dominate much of the industry. The company operates under strict privacy protocols that keep my personal identity separate from the brand's public image, a deliberate choice I made when founding the business because I wanted Maison Elodie to be known for its products rather than for who owned it. The fashion industry is full of personality-driven brands where the designer's image becomes inseparable from the clothing, and I deliberately chose a different path that would allow my work to speak for itself, without my personal life or family relationships becoming part of the brand narrative. This decision to remain anonymous as the owner and creative director of Maison Elodie meant that my family, including my sister Audrey, had no idea that I was the person behind one of the luxury brands she worked with regularly. They knew I worked in business, specifically in fashion retail and operations, but they assumed I had some kind of administrative or middle management position rather than understanding that I owned and operated a company generating 8 figures in annual revenue. Audrey had been modeling for Maison Elodie for the past 4 years, booking regular campaigns, runway shows, and editorial shoots that had become one of her most consistent and lucrative contracts. She frequently bragged to family members about working with such a prestigious brand, showing them the beautiful photography from our campaigns, and positioning herself as the family's fashion success story because she was the face of luxury brands, while I was just someone who worked behind the scenes in the business side of the industry. Standing at my mother's funeral in a dress that represented thousands of hours of design development, material sourcing, and artisanal construction, being told by my sister that I didn't understand fashion or success was both heartbreaking and revealing about how completely my family had misunderstood my career and achievements. But what Audrey didn't know as she mocked my clothing choices was that her modeling career was about to end, and that the decision to terminate her contract had already been made before she chose to humiliate me during the lowest moment of my life. Have you ever been attacked by someone who was completely dependent on you for their success, but who had no idea they were insulting the person who controlled their entire career? Because that's what happened at my mother's funeral, and it changed everything about my relationship with my sister and my family's understanding of who the successful Shaw daughter really was. The thing about my family that you need to understand is that they have always valued visible, public-facing success over substantive achievement that happens behind the scenes. My sister Audrey's modeling career was celebrated, discussed, and praised at every family gathering because it was something everyone could see and understand. Beautiful photographs, magazine features, runway shows, and the glamorous lifestyle that modeling supposedly represented. My entrepreneurial success building a fashion empire was dismissed or minimized because I deliberately kept my ownership private, and because the work I did wasn't as visually dramatic or easily understood by relatives who equated fashion success with being photographed, rather than with actually creating and selling products. This preference for visible achievement over substantial accomplishment shaped how my mother had treated us throughout our adult lives, though I want to be clear that I loved her deeply and understood that her favoritism came from a place of not fully understanding what I had built, rather than from any malicious intent. She was proud of both her daughters, but she understood Audrey's modeling work in ways she never quite grasped my business operations, design processes, or the complex challenges of building and scaling a luxury fashion brand in an intensely competitive industry. When Audrey booked her first significant modeling contract at age 23, fresh out of college and stunningly beautiful with the kind of bone structure and proportions that cameras love, my mother was overjoyed and immediately began telling everyone in our extended family about her daughter, the model. She displayed Audrey's tear sheets and magazine features prominently in her home, showed them to friends and neighbors, and made it clear that having a daughter in the fashion industry was something that brought her immense pride and satisfaction. Meanwhile, I was 26 years old, and in the early stages of building what would become Maison Elodie, working 18-hour days to develop my first collection, source materials from European suppliers, establish relationships with manufacturers who could meet my quality standards, and figure out the operational challenges of running a fashion business. The work was exhausting, expensive, and required technical knowledge about textiles, construction, fit, and production that went far beyond aesthetic sensibility. When I tried to explain to my mother what I was doing, the complexity of developing patterns that would fit diverse body types, the challenge of finding silk suppliers who could provide consistent quality, the logistics of managing production timelines across multiple countries, her eyes would glaze over and she would politely change the subject to something she found more interesting. She wasn't trying to be dismissive. She simply didn't understand or value work that happened in offices, factories, and design studios rather than in front of cameras. The contrast in how my mother treated our respective careers became more pronounced as Audrey's modeling work brought more visible markers of success, while my business operations remained mostly invisible to people outside the fashion industry. When Audrey booked a campaign for a major cosmetics brand, my mother threw a celebration dinner and invited the entire extended family to toast her achievement. When Maison Elodie's third collection sold out within 2 weeks of launch and generated over $1 million in revenue, my mother's response was, "That's nice, dear," before asking if I had seen Audrey's latest magazine spread. This pattern continued for years as I built my business through careful strategic planning, quality control, customer service excellence, and financial discipline that allowed steady growth without outside investors or crushing debt. Every milestone in my company's development, the first profitable quarter, securing relationships with luxury department stores, expanding our production capabilities, hiring a talented design team, was met with polite acknowledgement from my mother, while Audrey's modeling bookings were treated as major family achievements worthy of celebration and discussion. The financial disparity between our careers was stark and would have been obvious to anyone who looked closely at the numbers, but my family never asked about my income or business performance in ways that would have revealed how much more successful I was than Audrey. My company generated millions in annual revenue and provided me with substantial personal income that far exceeded what Audrey earned from modeling. But because I lived modestly, drove a practical car, and didn't display my wealth through obvious consumption, my family assumed I was doing fine, rather than understanding that I was actually building significant wealth. Audrey, meanwhile, spent most of what she earned maintaining the lifestyle she believed was necessary for a model: luxury apartment in an expensive neighborhood, designer wardrobe for personal wear, expensive beauty treatments, exotic vacations that she documented on social media, and the kind of conspicuous consumption that signaled success to people who equated spending with earning. She lived paycheck to paycheck despite earning good money, and she had accumulated credit card debt that she occasionally mentioned to family members as evidence of how expensive it was to maintain her professional image. The irony that I had to carefully manage in my dual role as Audrey's sister and her employer was that she was generating this debt partly through purchasing items from luxury brands, including my own, without understanding that the money she spent on Maison Elodie pieces was essentially circulating back to me while she accumulated personal debt. She owned probably $50,000 worth of my company's clothing, bought at full retail price because she didn't know she could have had anything she wanted for free if she had just known who owned the brand. Another layer of complexity in our relationship was that Audrey had been one of my most effective models in terms of representing the brand aesthetic and connecting with our target customer base. She had the kind of understated elegance that worked well with our design philosophy, and her social media following aligned well with the demographic we were trying to reach. When my creative director initially suggested booking Audrey for a campaign 4 years ago, I had approved the decision based purely on professional assessment that she was right for the brand, and I had maintained that professional relationship by ensuring she never received preferential treatment that other models didn't receive. Audrey didn't know that the contract negotiations, the booking confirmations, the payment schedules, and the creative direction for her shoots all ultimately came from decisions I made or approved as the company owner. She believed she had been discovered and booked based purely on her modeling talents and industry reputation, and in fairness, that was largely true. She was good at her job and had earned the work through her professional capabilities. But the fact remained that she was financially dependent on a company I owned, while simultaneously treating me as the less successful sister who didn't understand fashion or achievement. The family dynamics around our mother's illness and death had revealed even more clearly how differently Audrey and I were valued within our family structure. When our mother was diagnosed with pneumonia that quickly progressed to serious respiratory complications, I had immediately rearranged my work schedule, delegated urgent business responsibilities to my management team, and spent as much time as possible at the hospital providing support and coordinating with medical staff about treatment options. Audrey, in contrast, had been in Paris for Fashion Week when our mother was hospitalized, and she had initially been reluctant to return because she had several runway shows and meetings scheduled that she felt were important for her career. When she did finally return 3 days into our mother's hospitalization, she had made it clear that she was sacrificing significant professional opportunities to be there, and she seemed to expect recognition for prioritizing family over work, in a way that suggested she believed her career demands were more important than mine. During our mother's final days, I had handled the practical arrangements, medical decisions, and family communications, while Audrey focused on her emotional response to the crisis and her need for support and comfort from relatives who gathered at the hospital. I don't say this to criticize how Audrey processed her grief, because people handle loss differently and there's no right way to respond to a parent dying. But I do note that the family seemed to expect me to manage logistics and provide stability, while allowing Audrey to be emotionally fragile, once again treating my role as the practical, behind-the-scenes support, while Audrey was the more valuable, visible family member whose feelings took priority. After our mother passed away, I had taken responsibility for funeral planning, obituary writing, coordinating with the funeral home, selecting flowers, arranging for the reception venue, contacting extended family members, and handling the thousands of small details that death requires. Audrey had helped with some decisions, but she had largely focused on selecting which photographs to display, planning what she would wear, and managing her emotional processing of the loss. I had chosen my funeral outfit carefully from Maison Elodie's current collection, selecting a dress that honored my mother's memory through its elegance and craftsmanship, while remaining appropriate for a solemn occasion. The dress was made from black silk crepe with a modest neckline, three-quarter sleeves, and a length that fell just below the knee, the kind of garment that women who understand quality would recognize as exceptional, but that wouldn't draw attention away from the purpose of the gathering. Have you ever carefully chosen clothing to honor someone you loved, only to have a family member publicly mock that choice while completely misunderstanding its value and significance? Because that's what happened when Audrey decided to use our mother's funeral as an opportunity to reinforce her supposed superiority over the sister she viewed as a failure. The funeral service was held at a historic chapel that our mother had always admired, with afternoon light filtering through stained glass windows and creating the kind of peaceful, contemplative atmosphere that seemed appropriate for saying goodbye to someone who had valued beauty and grace throughout her life. About 80 people had gathered, family members, longtime friends, professional colleagues from our mother's career as a school administrator, and neighbors who had known her for decades. I had spent the morning of the funeral feeling completely hollowed out by grief, barely able to function through the motions of getting dressed, applying minimal makeup, and preparing myself emotionally to deliver the eulogy I had written and rewritten multiple times. The dress I had chosen was one of my favorite pieces from our collection, something I wore regularly to important professional events, and something that made me feel confident and put together during times when maintaining composure was essential. When I arrived at the chapel, extended family members were already gathering in the foyer, sharing memories and offering each other comfort and support during the difficult day. My aunts, uncles, and cousins greeted me with hugs and condolences, and several people commented positively on how put together and elegant I looked, which I appreciated as acknowledgement that I was maintaining dignity during grief. Audrey arrived about 20 minutes after I did, making a somewhat dramatic entrance in a black designer dress that featured elaborate detailing, expensive accessories, and the kind of fashion-forward styling that drew immediate attention from everyone in the room. She looked beautiful, as she always did, but her outfit was more about making a statement than about honoring our mother's memory or maintaining appropriate funeral solemnity. Several relatives immediately clustered around her, complimenting her appearance and treating her arrival as if she were the main event, rather than just another mourner at our mother's funeral. I watched this from across the room, feeling a familiar mixture of hurt and resignation about how family dynamics always seemed to center Audrey's presence while treating mine as background scenery. The service itself was emotional but beautiful, with a pastor who had known our mother delivering thoughtful reflections on her life and character, several family friends sharing memories and stories, and a music selection that our mother had specified in the advance directives she had prepared years earlier. When it came time for me to deliver the eulogy I had prepared, I walked to the podium barely able to breathe through the weight of grief pressing on my chest. I spoke about our mother's dedication to education, her love for her daughters, her passion for literature and art, her quiet kindness toward everyone she encountered, and the hole her death would leave in all our lives. I made it through the entire speech without breaking down completely, though my voice cracked several times and I had to pause to compose myself more than once. When I returned to my seat, Audrey reached over and squeezed my hand, and in that moment, I felt like we were united in our grief and our love for our mother, despite whatever competitive dynamics usually existed between us. That sense of united grief lasted until we moved to the reception following the burial service, held at a nearby country club where our mother had sometimes played bridge with friends. The room was filled with food, flowers, and people sharing stories about our mother while trying to balance grief with celebration of her life. I was standing near the beverage table talking with our mother's oldest friend, sharing memories and receiving comfort from someone who had known our mother for over 40 years, when I heard Audrey's voice cutting clearly across the room. "Penelope, where did you even get that dress? It looks like something from a department store clearance rack." The comment was loud enough to be heard by at least a dozen people nearby, and I felt every eye in the vicinity turn toward me to assess the dress that was apparently so inadequate that Audrey needed to comment on it publicly at our mother's funeral reception. I looked across the room to see my sister standing with our 2 aunts and several cousins, apparently discussing fashion choices at a funeral, as if this were an appropriate topic during family mourning. "Seriously," Audrey continued, clearly enjoying the attention her comment was generating. "I know you work in fashion business or whatever, but you could at least try to dress appropriately for important family events. This is Mom's funeral, not some casual office day. Some of us understand that appearances matter, especially when we're representing the family in public." The suggestion that I wasn't dressed appropriately for our mother's funeral, when I was wearing a $29,000 dress from my own luxury collection, was so absurd that I initially thought she must be joking or making some kind of reference I didn't understand. But her expression and the expressions of the relatives gathered around her made it clear that this was a serious criticism, and that they agreed with her assessment that my clothing was somehow inadequate or disrespectful. Our Aunt Patricia, our mother's older sister, joined in Audrey's critique with her own observations. "Audrey, you always look so polished and professional. You've really made something of yourself in the fashion world. It's wonderful that you understand quality and can represent the family with such style." The implicit comparison between Audrey's supposed understanding of quality versus my apparent lack of fashion sense would have been almost funny if it weren't happening at my mother's funeral, and if it weren't so painfully revealing about how my family valued visible appearance over substance and achievement. Audrey seemed emboldened by Patricia's support and continued her assessment of my supposed failure to dress appropriately. "I just think if you're going to be in the fashion industry, even just on the business side, you should make an effort to at least look like you understand clothing. I mean, I'm literally paid to know what quality looks like, and trust me, that dress is not it. You'd never see me wearing something so basic and cheap to an important event." The irony of being told I didn't understand quality by someone who was wearing my company's designs, who had built her modeling career partly on representing my brand, and who was about to lose her job for insulting me at a funeral, was so complete that I almost laughed despite the pain of being attacked during the worst day of my life. "You know what the saddest part is?" Audrey continued, apparently not satisfied with her initial critique, and determined to make her point as publicly and cruelly as possible. "Mom always hoped you'd be more like me. She wanted both her daughters to be successful, but she understood that I actually achieved something in fashion while you just kind of exist on the periphery of an industry you don't really understand." Even today, at her funeral, you can't manage to dress in a way that would make her proud. The claim that our mother had wanted me to be more like Audrey, delivered publicly at the reception following her funeral, was the final element that transformed this from a cruel fashion critique into something fundamentally unforgivable. Using our dead mother's supposed disappointment in me as ammunition for family humiliation revealed something about Audrey's character that couldn't be excused or explained away through grief, stress, or sibling rivalry. Have you ever been publicly mocked at a parent's funeral by someone who had no idea they were insulting their own boss and destroying their career with every word? Because that's when I made the decision that would permanently alter our family dynamics and teach Audrey exactly who the successful Shaw sister really was. Standing at my mother's funeral reception, listening to my sister tell me that I was a family disappointment who dressed poorly and didn't understand the fashion industry she supposedly dominated, I made a decision that was both professionally justified and personally satisfying. People who humiliate you at funerals while unknowingly depending on you for their careers need to learn exactly where power actually resides in their relationships. And Audrey was about to receive an education about the difference between being a model who works for a brand versus being the owner who controls that brand. The decision to reveal my identity as the owner of Maison Elodie wasn't made impulsively or emotionally. It was the culmination of years of watching my family misunderstand my achievements while celebrating Audrey's visibility, and it was the final response to cruelty that crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed regardless of family dynamics or personal feelings. You can criticize someone's career choices. You can favor one sibling over another. You can fail to understand someone's work, but you cannot publicly humiliate someone at their parent's funeral and expect no consequences for that behavior. The termination letter ending Audrey's modeling contract with Maison Elodie had actually been drafted 2 weeks earlier, before our mother's death, and therefore certainly before Audrey's funeral attack. The decision to not renew her contract had been made for professional reasons that had nothing to do with our family relationship. Her social media engagement rates had been declining, her booking fees had increased to levels that weren't justified by the value she brought to the brand, and our creative director had suggested that we needed to refresh our model roster with faces that better represented where we wanted to take the brand's aesthetic direction. I had signed the termination letter, to be delivered to Audrey's agent at the end of her current contract period, and I had felt no particular emotion about the business decision because it was based purely on professional assessment rather than personal feelings. Audrey was good at her job, but she wasn't irreplaceable, and our brand would continue thriving with new models who could better represent our evolving vision. But Audrey's decision to mock me at our mother's funeral changed the timeline and the manner of her termination, because I no longer felt any obligation to deliver the news professionally and privately through industry channels. If she wanted to publicly humiliate me at a family gathering, then she could learn about her career consequences in an equally public setting, and she could understand that the power she thought she had in the fashion industry was actually entirely dependent on the goodwill of the sister she had just called a failure. I waited until the reception was winding down and most guests had departed, leaving only close family members, including Audrey, our aunts and uncles, and several cousins who had heard Audrey's critique of my dress and who had apparently agreed with her assessment. I asked everyone to gather in a private room at the country club, explaining that I had some information to share about our mother's estate and some family business that needed to be discussed. Once everyone was assembled, I began speaking in the calm, professional voice I used for business presentations when I needed to convey important information with authority and clarity. I want to address something that happened earlier today during the reception. Audrey made some comments about my dress, my understanding of fashion, and my supposed failure to achieve success in the fashion industry. Before I respond to those comments, I want to show you all something. I pulled out my phone and displayed the legal documents I had prepared for exactly this kind of revelation, though I had never imagined it would happen at our mother's funeral. The documents showed my ownership of Maison Elodie, including business registration papers, trademark filings, financial statements showing the company's revenue and my personal income, and the corporate structure that made it clear I wasn't just an employee or investor, but the sole founder and owner of a luxury fashion brand that several family members knew by reputation. This is Maison Elodie's most recent financial statement, I explained, showing them a summary document that revealed 8-figure annual revenue. I founded this company 12 years ago when I was 23, and I've built it into one of the more successful independent luxury brands in the contemporary fashion market. The dress I'm wearing today is from our current collection and retails for $29,000, though I obviously didn't pay retail since I designed it and own the company that produced it. The room was completely silent as family members processed this information and began to understand the implications of what I was revealing. I could see confusion on most faces, shock on others, and growing horror on Audrey's face as she started to realize where this revelation was heading. Audrey, you said earlier that you're literally paid to know what quality looks like, and that I exist on the periphery of an industry I don't really understand. I want to clarify something for you and for everyone here. I don't exist on the periphery of the fashion industry. I own a significant piece of it. And the reason you're paid to know what quality looks like is because I pay you to represent the quality that my company creates. I pulled up the modeling contracts on my phone, showing Audrey's signed agreements with Maison Elodie spanning the past 4 years, including the payment schedules that showed she had earned approximately $180,000 from my company during that time. I let everyone see the signature on the contracts. My signature as CEO and creative director, authorizing her bookings and approving her compensation. For the past 4 years, you've been modeling for my company while telling the family about how successful you are in fashion and how I don't really understand the industry. Every campaign you've bragged about, every runway show you've walked for us, every paycheck you've received from Maison Elodie, those all came from a company I built and decisions I made about which models could best represent our brand aesthetic. Audrey's face had gone completely white, and she appeared to be having difficulty breathing as the full scope of what she had done began to register. She had just publicly mocked her employer at a funeral, insulted the owner of a company that provided significant income, and revealed to everyone present that she had been completely ignorant about basic facts regarding her own career and family relationships. The dress you called cheap and basic is actually a piece that took our design team 4 months to develop. That's made from Italian silk that we source from a specific mill outside Florence, and that has architectural construction requiring over 30 hours of skilled sewing work. It represents exactly the kind of understated luxury that our brand is known for. Quality that doesn't need to announce itself through obvious logos or attention-seeking design, because the women who wear it understand that real elegance is quiet. I turned to address our aunts and cousins who had joined in criticizing my appearance while praising Audrey's supposed fashion superiority. I appreciate that you've all been supportive of Audrey's modeling career, and I don't blame you for not knowing about my company since I've deliberately kept my ownership private. But I do want you all to understand that when you praise Audrey for making something of herself in fashion, you're actually celebrating her ability to be photographed wearing clothes that I designed, produced, and marketed through a company I built without family support or recognition. The room remained silent except for the sound of Audrey's sharp breathing as she processed the devastating implications of her funeral attack on the person who controlled her modeling career. Our Aunt Patricia, who had praised Audrey's polish and professionalism while implying I lacked those qualities, looked stricken as she realized she had participated in humiliating the most professionally successful person in the room. "There's one more thing I need to share," I continued, pulling up the termination letter that had been drafted weeks earlier. "Audrey, your contract with Maison Elodie expires at the end of this month, and we made the decision not to renew it. This decision was made for professional reasons before Mom died, and certainly before today's funeral. But I want you to understand that models who insult their employers at family funerals, who mock the owner's clothing choices, and who claim their boss is a failure who doesn't understand fashion, those models don't get letters of recommendation, they don't get continued bookings, and they don't get polite industry explanations for why their contracts ended." I handed Audrey the termination letter, which included the standard language about contract conclusion, and the additional language about professional conduct concerns that would make it difficult for her to book similar luxury brand work in the future. In the fashion industry, reputation matters enormously, and being terminated by a respected brand for conduct issues essentially blacklists a model from similar high-end work. "You called me the family failure at our mother's funeral," I said directly to Audrey. "You told me I exist on the periphery of an industry I don't understand. You said Mom wanted me to be more like you. I want you to understand in front of everyone here that you've been wrong about all of it. I'm not the failure. I'm the person who built the company that made your success possible. I don't exist on the periphery. I own a piece of the center." And Mom was proud of both of us. But she would have been horrified by how you've treated me today. Have you ever watched someone realize that they've destroyed their career by insulting someone they didn't recognize had complete power over their professional life? Because Audrey's collapse into understanding was both devastating to watch and absolutely necessary for her to learn who had actually been successful in our family all along. The immediate impact of my revelation was like watching a building implode in controlled demolition, with Audrey's entire self-concept and understanding of our family dynamics collapsing into rubble as she processed the information I had just shared. She tried several times to speak, but no coherent words emerged, just sounds that indicated she was trying to form responses that her brain couldn't quite organize because the shock was too complete. Our Aunt Patricia was the first family member to speak, her voice shaking with what sounded like a mixture of embarrassment and horror. "Penelope, I had no idea. I'm so sorry for what I said earlier. I never understood what your work actually involved. Audrey always talked about the brands she worked with, and I didn't realize you owned one of them." Her apology was sincere, but also revealed the fundamental problem with how my family had understood success. They had valued Audrey's visible modeling work, while completely dismissing my behind-the-scenes entrepreneurial achievements, because one was easy to understand and photograph, while the other required actual knowledge about business, design, and the fashion industry to appreciate. Several cousins who had been present during Audrey's critique of my dress now looked mortified as they realized they had participated in mocking a successful business owner at a funeral, while praising someone whose career depended entirely on that owner's decisions. The family hierarchy that had positioned Audrey as the successful Shaw sister and me as the mediocre one was completely inverted, and everyone present was processing the reality that they had been wrong about which daughter had actually achieved something significant. But the most devastating impact was on Audrey herself, whose entire professional identity and sense of superiority had been built on the belief that she was the family's fashion success story, while I was just someone who worked in the background of an industry she dominated. Learning that she had actually been working for me, that her paychecks came from my company, that her bragging about Maison LOD campaigns had actually been bragging about representing a brand her younger sister owned. This was destroying not just her sense of family dynamics, but her fundamental understanding of her own achievements. You own Maison LOD? She finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The whole time I've been working for your company? For the past 4 years, yes, I confirmed. And you were good at it, professionally speaking. You represented our aesthetic well, your measurements were perfect for our sample sizes, and your social media presence aligned with our target demographic. But you were never irreplaceable, and you were certainly never in a position to lecture me about understanding fashion or quality when the clothes you were modeling and the paychecks you were receiving all came from a company I built. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, and there was genuine confusion in her voice along with the devastation. Why would you hide something like that from your own sister? I didn't hide it specifically from you, I explained. I kept my ownership private from everyone because I wanted the brand to be known for the quality of the work rather than for who owned it. But I also have to admit that watching you brag to the family about modeling for my company while treating me like I didn't understand fashion, that was educational about how you actually viewed me and my achievements. I never would have said those things if I had known, Audrey said, which was probably true, but which also revealed that her respect for me was entirely conditional on knowing I had power over her career, rather than being based on any genuine appreciation of my worth as a person or professional. That's exactly the problem, I replied. You said those things because you genuinely believed I was a failure who didn't understand fashion, and who existed on the periphery of your industry. Learning that I actually own a significant piece of that industry doesn't change what you believed about me. It just changes whether you feel safe expressing those beliefs publicly. Our Uncle James, who had been silent throughout the entire revelation, finally spoke up. Penelope, what you've built is truly impressive. I'm sorry that we didn't understand or appreciate it before. But is it really necessary to end Audrey's contract over what happened today? She's your sister, and she's grieving, and people say things they don't mean when they're emotional. His attempt to minimize what had happened and reframe Audrey's funeral attack as understandable grief behavior was typical of family dynamics that prioritized maintaining relationships over addressing harmful behavior. But I had spent years watching my family dismiss my achievements while celebrating Audrey's visibility, and I was done prioritizing family harmony over professional boundaries and personal respect. The decision to end Audrey's contract was made weeks ago for professional reasons, I explained. But even if it hadn't been, models who publicly insult company owners at family funerals don't get contract renewals. This isn't about personal feelings or family relationships. It's about professional conduct and understanding that actions have consequences. Audrey had begun crying, though whether from genuine remorse, shock at the career implications, or just overwhelm at how dramatically her understanding of reality had been altered in the past 20 minutes was unclear. What am I supposed to do? She asked, her voice breaking. Maison Elodie was one of my best contracts. I have rent to pay, bills to cover, a lifestyle that requires steady income. I can't just lose this work without anything to replace it. The irony of her describing financial pressure to someone she had just called a failure wasn't lost on anyone in the room, but I didn't point it out because the lesson was already clear enough without additional cruelty from me. You'll do what every other model does when contracts end, I said. You'll book other work, or you'll transition to a different career, or you'll figure out a lifestyle you can actually afford on whatever income you can generate. That's what adults do when they lose jobs. They adapt, rather than expecting the employers they insulted to continue paying them. The family members present were clearly uncomfortable with the situation, caught between loyalty to Audrey and recognition that she had behaved terribly, and that I was completely justified in terminating her contract and revealing the true nature of our professional relationship. Several people tried to suggest compromises or ways to work this out as a family, but I made it clear that my business decisions weren't subject to family mediation, and that Audrey's contract termination was final. "I want everyone here to understand something," I said, addressing the group one final time before ending this devastating conversation. "I've spent 12 years building a successful company while being treated as the less accomplished daughter. I've watched family gatherings where Audrey's modeling bookings were celebrated while my actual business ownership and financial success were dismissed as boring or unimpressive. I've listened to advice about how I should be more like my sister, should understand fashion better, should achieve more visible success." I looked directly at Audrey as I continued. "And today, at our mother's funeral, you publicly mocked my dress, called me a failure, and said Mom wished I was more like you. That dress cost $29,000 from a company I own. My success has funded a lifestyle you can't afford on your modeling income alone. And Mom was proud of both of us. But she never understood that I had actually achieved far more than you, because I kept my success private, rather than making it the center of family conversations." The room remained silent as everyone processed the complete reversal of everything they had believed about the Shaw sisters, and which one was actually successful. I gathered my belongings and prepared to leave, having said everything that needed to be said, and having no interest in continuing a conversation that would just involve damage control and attempts to minimize what Audrey had done. "I'll be heading back to the city tonight," I announced. "The estate attorney will contact everyone about Mom's will and the distribution of her assets. Audrey, you'll receive formal notification from your agent about the contract termination and the reasons for it. Everyone else, thank you for coming to Mom's funeral and for supporting our family during this difficult time." I walked out of that country club knowing that my relationship with Audrey had been permanently altered, that my family's understanding of success had been completely restructured, and that the anonymous business owner they had all dismissed for years had finally revealed exactly what she had built while they were busy celebrating someone else's visible but less substantial achievements. Have you ever experienced the satisfaction of finally revealing the truth about your success to people who had spent years underestimating you? Because walking away from that funeral reception, knowing that everyone finally understood who the successful Shaw daughter really was, felt like justice for years of being dismissed and minimized. 6 months after my mother's funeral and the revelation that destroyed Audrey's modeling career, I had continued building Maison Elodie into an even more successful luxury brand, while watching my sister struggle with the career and personal consequences of her decision to publicly mock her employer at a family funeral. The fashion industry is small and well-connected, and word had spread quickly about why Audrey Shaw's contract with a respected luxury brand had been terminated for professional conduct concerns. Other brands that Audrey had worked with began quietly declining to book her for new campaigns, not because anyone had told them specifically what happened, but because fashion industry professionals talk among themselves about models who create problems, and being terminated by Maison Elodie for conduct issues was enough to make most brands cautious about working with her. Her modeling income dropped dramatically, forcing her to move from her expensive apartment to a more modest place, downgrade her lifestyle, and confront the reality that her career had been built on representing brands, rather than owning any real power within the industry. The most painful part for Audrey was probably the realization that she had destroyed the most lucrative and consistent contract in her portfolio by insulting the owner of the company at a funeral, and that this self-inflicted career damage was entirely preventable if she had just treated me with basic respect and decency, regardless of whether she knew about my business ownership. My company had thrived after refreshing our model roster with new faces, who better represented where we wanted to take the brand's aesthetic direction. The campaign we shot 3 months after firing Audrey performed better than any previous campaign in terms of customer engagement, sales conversion, and brand perception metrics. It turned out that we didn't need her specific face or image to succeed. We just needed models who could represent elegance, sophistication, and the kind of understated luxury that our target customers valued. The family dynamics had shifted dramatically as well. with relatives who had previously dismissed my career now asking detailed questions about my business, showing genuine interest in how I had built the company, and expressing belated pride in my entrepreneurial success. The change in how they treated me was gratifying, but also somewhat sad, because it revealed that their respect and interest were conditional on knowing I had power and wealth, rather than being based on genuine appreciation of my worth as a person. My relationship with Audrey had remained essentially non-existent since the funeral revelation. She had tried several times to reach out through text messages and emails, and her communications had evolved through several predictable stages: initial shock and denial, anger at me for ruining her career, attempts at bargaining where she suggested we could work things out, if I would just give her another chance, depression about the consequences she was facing, and finally, something resembling acceptance that she had destroyed her own career through her choices and behavior. I hadn't responded to any of her messages because I felt that I had said everything necessary at the funeral, and that continuing to engage would just create opportunities for more manipulation, excuses, or attempts to minimize what she had done. People who publicly mock you at a parent's funeral, while unknowingly insulting their employer, don't deserve continued access to your emotional energy or professional opportunities, regardless of family relationships or sibling bonds. The will reading had been another interesting family gathering where the shifting dynamics were on full display. Our mother had left her modest estate divided equally between Audrey and me, along with personal letters she had written to each of us before her death. My letter had been beautiful and affirming, expressing pride in both my professional success and my character, and acknowledging that she had perhaps not fully understood or appreciated what I was building during her lifetime, but that she recognized I was creating something meaningful and impressive. Most tellingly, my mother's letter included a passage that suggested she had actually understood far more about my business success than she had ever explicitly acknowledged during family conversations. I know you keep your work private, and I respect that choice, but I want you to know that I've always been proud of what you've built. Your father and I raised you to be independent and capable, and you've exceeded every hope we had for your success. Don't let anyone, including your sister, make you feel like your achievements matter less because they happen behind the scenes instead of in front of cameras. The letter suggested that my mother had known, or at least strongly suspected, that I was more successful than family conversations indicated, and that she had deliberately avoided discussing it publicly out of respect for my privacy, and perhaps out of concern for how the information might affect Audrey's self-esteem. The revelation was both comforting and sad. Comforting because it meant my mother had recognized my worth. Sad because she had felt the need to protect Audrey's feelings by minimizing my success during family gatherings. Audrey's letter from our mother had apparently included gentle encouragement to remember that success means different things to different people, and to be kind to your sister because you're both more alike than you realize. Advice that Audrey had obviously failed to follow when she decided to attack me at the funeral. The professional fashion media had eventually picked up the story, though not with names initially. Just industry gossip about a prominent model who had been fired by a luxury brand after insulting the owner at a family event. The details were vague enough that most readers wouldn't know specifically who was involved, but everyone in the fashion industry who knew both Maison Elodie and Audrey's modeling career understood exactly what had happened. Several fashion journalists had reached out requesting official comment or interview about the situation, but I had maintained my policy of keeping personal matters private and declining to discuss anything about my family relationships or the specific circumstances of terminated contracts. The mystery and vagueness actually worked in my favor professionally because it reinforced Maison Elodie's reputation as a brand that maintained high standards and professional boundaries, rather than one that engaged in public drama or personal conflicts. The business had continued growing at a rate that exceeded my most optimistic projections, with revenue increasing by 40% over the previous year, and expansion into new markets that I had been developing for several years. We had secured partnerships with several prestigious retailers, launched successful collaborations with other luxury brands, and built a customer base that was loyal, affluent, and genuinely committed to our aesthetic and values. The personal satisfaction of knowing that I had built something substantial and successful while keeping it private from a family that wouldn't have appreciated it properly was immense. I had proven to myself that I could achieve significant success without family support, recognition, or understanding, and that external validation from relatives who had consistently underestimated me was unnecessary for my sense of professional accomplishment. 1 year after the funeral confrontation, I received a letter from Audrey that was different from her previous attempts at communication. Instead of making excuses, minimizing what happened, or trying to negotiate her way back into my good graces, she had written what appeared to be a genuine acknowledgement of how completely she had misunderstood our respective successes and how badly she had treated me throughout our adult lives. "I've spent the past year trying to understand how I could have been so blind about what you built," she wrote. "I thought being visible meant being successful, and I thought your choice to work behind the scenes meant you hadn't achieved anything significant. I was completely wrong, and I'm genuinely sorry for how I treated you, especially at Mom's funeral when you were grieving and needed family support instead of attacks." The letter went on to explain that losing her modeling career had forced her to reevaluate her entire understanding of success, value, and what actually mattered in both professional and personal relationships. She had started working in fashion retail, which had given her new perspective on how much work went into building brands versus just representing them in photographs. "I'll never know if you'll forgive me for what I did," the letter concluded. "But I want you to know that I finally understand why you built your success privately, why you didn't tell the family about owning Maison Elodie, and why you chose to reveal it the way you did at the funeral. I humiliated you publicly while being completely ignorant about the fact that I was insulting my own employer. I deserved to face consequences for that behavior, and I understand why you made the choices you made." Her letter was more self-aware and honest than anything else she had written since the funeral. But I still didn't respond because I had learned that sometimes the healthiest choice is maintaining distance from people who demonstrated they would only respect you after learning you had power over their careers, rather than respecting you inherently as a person and family member. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by family members who didn't understand or appreciate what you had built behind the scenes, please hit that subscribe button to Sweet Revenge Diaries for more stories about revealing hidden success and teaching people that visible achievement isn't always the same as substantial accomplishment. Sometimes the best revenge is proving that the person they dismissed as a failure was actually the one with real power all along. See you in our next story.